Hello and welcome back. For the last few weeks I've been writing and I now have a completed first draft. Let's take a look at it. Okay, when I finish the first draft I like to print it out at either double spaced or 1.5 space. So here is my manuscript, and it means that with double spacing I can write in between, and what I'm going to do is go through it with the red pen and find things that are wrong. What I'm looking for is firstly to make sure that I have all the right scenes in the right order. This is not a space to try and make things beautiful. It's not about flowing text. Really what I'm looking for is to make sure the story works. So that's the focus now. We want to read the draft, find out what's wrong with it, find out how we improve the story, and then from there, that's where we'll start beginning to work on the writing. But really, we need a good story first. So let's jump in and see what we can find. So what you'll find, when I look down at this, I can see I've got some issues with plot logic. I've got some pages that are just covered in red pen. It's pen everywhere. But I'll just mention a few of the things that I noticed. So one of the first things I discovered is that the opening before we meet Cushing is really quite cold and clinical. There aren't enough characters, so our main character, our lead character, Robert, doesn't really have people to talk to and interact with, and as it's not really about people, it's more about his situation, it actually feels dull. And we don't want that, so it may be a case that I need to look at injecting a little bit more life into it. This is only for the first few pages. It's a case of Robert, his wife is taken, which is exciting, but then he sits around miserable. But we shouldn't be miserable when we read it. We should be quite engaged. And at the moment, it feels a bit miserable. So that was the first thing that jumped out. One of the things I realised I was doing is I would throw in extra characters. I had Cushing's housekeeper. In one scene, I call her Mrs. Pear Tree. In another scene, I call her Mrs. Peach Tree. There's an obvious mistake. One of the things that I find I do quite often is I'll be writing something and the scene ends, and for some reason I'll almost write the same thing again on the end of the scene. So I end up with two endings to the scene. And this is a place where I tend to be going through with the red pen, crossing things out because the scene's ended. Why am I repeating myself? It's just sometimes what I do. Right, here's one that's really bugged me when I was reading it back. I was quite enjoying the story, thinking this isn't bad, this is quite nice. And suddenly it went into a very dull description of tunnels. There was no reason for it. It broke away from being about people and started being about the landscape and the situation. So if I read a little bit, it gives you an idea of how bad it is. The tunnel looked as though it stretched the length of the street above. He turned right and walked the length, noticing heavy doors with strong-looking fastenings. This was a storage area. The doors were solid. He pressed his eye to the gap between them, but could see nothing but darkness. He counted at least 20 of these storerooms. At the end of the tunnel, he reversed his direction and made his way back to the junction. I mean, it's so boring. What on earth? It's a tunnel. All I needed to say was Robert went in and saw there was tunnels with lots of doors, but there was nothing there. So he looked in the other direction. One sentence, that's all it needs. I actually go on for almost a page describing tunnels where there's nothing there. So that can definitely come out. Now, I did find a space of plot logic where I'd actually made a mistake. And the plot logic is, how does Robert and Cushing come to learn about Isambard? And in my original draft, in the original plan, what I'd said was that the girl who falls from the train sees that he's wearing this symbol as a pendant from the Temple of Other. And once they've identified that symbol, they're able to find the Temple of Other and find out who he was. Yet, when I wrote it, I've actually written, Isambard wasn't a member of our temple, but he had highly placed friends who knew of us. So I made this point that Isambard was not in the Temple of Other. Now this has caused me some problems because I've gone into this at length to explain that he wasn't a member of the Temple of Other. So why would he be wearing a pendant? It doesn't make sense. I've got a problem with the plot logic. So this is something that I need to correct in the second draft. I've got a section here, this is quite typical, where I can't really understand what I've written. I've written something about a fire, but the description of how it happened, although it was clear in my head, when you read it back, it's not clear at all. It doesn't really make much sense. So there's just, oftentimes I'll need to add some clarity, and I'll write a little margin note saying just clarify this, make it understandable. I've got one moment that is so show don't tell problem. It's kind of idiotic, really. I've actually written, the next full moon was November the 16th. A few days before the fateful day, Robert received 2 surprises on his farm. Why am I saying show the 2 surprises and show him being surprised? Instead, I've actually written it. I mean, I may have put it in just as a note to myself, but when you read it, it jars because it jumps out. You're telling the story. You need to show it. We need to show a surprise happening, or we need to show something happens, and we need to show that Robert is surprised by it. We don't say it. We show it. I've got a nice piece here of conversation where Robert and Julia are talking, and they went out on horses, and they're talking about how they traipsed around in the countryside, and they went through all of these country lanes looking for somewhere, and they spent a long time and then discovered they were actually very close. The problem is that didn't happen earlier in the story. They just went out riding on the horses, but it was a nice piece of conversation. So now when I come to the second draft, I need to actually put this into the second draft, that they ride around on the horses and they kind of meander around and don't really go anywhere. But instead, in the first draft, they get on horses, they go for a ride. Later on, they say, do you remember that time we went for a ride and we were riding around for such a long time and we couldn't find where we were going? And a reader will think, no, I don't remember that. You found the place quite easily. So that's something I need to go back and check. Got some more points to clarify here. Got some things to change around. It's quite good. It's come in at the right size, which I'd aim for 25,000 words, and it's come in at 26,000, which I can live with that. And there's probably a few things to cut out. And as I trim it down to make it faster, it'll probably come in at sort of 23 to 24,000. Is what I'm guessing so far. But the size is right. The scenes are largely in the right order. I've only seen one scene so far, which was a telegram that Robert sends to Cushing. And he sends this telegram, but then in the next scene, they talk about the contents of the telegram. So it's like we've done it twice. So that needs to come out. This is a good reason why you don't spend time polishing. I've basically written the same thing twice. Now I could have spent a long time polishing those and making the text beautiful, only to realize, oh, I need to get rid of one of them. So either get rid of the telegram, or get rid of the scene where they discuss the telegram, but we need to get rid of one of them. Okay, so this has turned out actually better than I imagined. It may be because I'm making a video for you to watch and see how I'm doing it. It may be that I was more consciously aware of how I was planning the story, so it's worked out a little bit better than my usual first drafts. There's only really 1 or 2 scenes that need to be removed, and nothing needs to be changed. But I've now got a good idea of where I need to go for the second draft. I'll now work through this and change things to get that story right. And that's what I'm looking for with the second draft. I want to have a complete story from start to finish, with all of those holes in the plot logic filled, with all of the right scenes in the right order. And from there, then we can start making it beautiful. And that's what we'll look at next time. So until then, keep writing, and we'll see you real soon.